known friend of the destitute and the colored.
When Himrod bought the properties, which essentially went from the backyards of the millionaires who lived on 6th Street down to the Bayfront, and chopped that up into little tracts that he offered to free blacks, he was in effect rubbing the conflict between himself as an abolitionist and the slave owners. Many of those millionaires were at that time slave owners. He was rubbing the existence of the free blacks and their position in the community and the New Jerusalem compound in the faces of the wealthy folks, and creating a terrible conflict.
In 1824, when black children were prohibited from attending the public school, Himrod opened the French Street Sabbath School for Colored Children, also called the Himrod Mission. He and his wife conspired with black abolitionists to shelter fugitives in their home near the waterfront, providing food, clothes, and money for the long trip to Canada.
This was no uncommon occurrence to find one or more slaves awaiting transportation in the kitchen or dining room of the house when I would come down to breakfast, which was at 6 a.m. sharp every morning, summer or winter. No questions were asked as to who was this man and where does he want. The entire household knew that he was seeking what he was unable to obtain in this country, its freedom. And we all fully understood that we were to do all in our power to make him comfortable. We were Himrod II.
Fugitives relied on the goodwill of people like Bosberg and Himrod to pay for their passage to Canada, usually through Detroit or Buffalo. But westerly winds, makeshift boats, and Lake Erie's current made for treacherous travel.
Lake Erie on a schooner, you'd find yourself showing up on the Canadian side somewhere around the base of Long Point. And when you left there, you'd find yourself showing up somewhere around the actual Beulah. So instead of having yourself a 160-mile ride to Detroit, it would turn out to be a 300-mile zigzag ride back and forth. And the slaves that left this side of the world to try to get to the Canadian-held free lands would have been taking those terrible, terrible rides.
With the arrival of the Great Lakes steamships in the 1830s, freedom seekers found refuge among the black men who worked on board as stewards, cooks, or mechanics.
The new and splendid low-pressure steam packet Erie, built at the Keystone City of that name in 1838, T.J. Titus, master, will leave Buffalo for Mackinac, Green Bay, Milwaukee, Chicago, St. Joseph, and Grand River, touching at ports of Lake Erie and at Detroit on Wednesday, the 16th of August at 10 o'clock a.m.
It is not known whether the steamship City of Erie was among the vessels called abolition boats, but as fate would have it, its captain would soon be won over to the cause. It happened during one of the greatest disasters in Great Lakes history. On the night of August 9, 1841, after a round-trip run to Port Dover, Canada, and an extended sail to Buffalo, she was powering back to Erie, about 4 miles offshore of Sugar Creek, New York, when barrels of paint and varnish placed on the boiler deck too close to the stacks erupted in flames. The explosion sent more than 250 passengers into the water, many of them immigrants from Germany and Switzerland who did not know how to swim. Only 28 survived. But for the efforts of a strong swimmer, a black fireman, who hoisted him into a yawl, Captain Titus would have perished. A few years later, when a slave catcher confronted 2 Kentucky fugitives on board his ship, Titus gave them the slip and delivered the fugitives to safety. He said their liberty had been paid 1,000-fold by the black man who saved his life. The Great Lakes were flush with heroes. Benjamin Bass Fleming, the last survivor of Perry's command in the Battle of Lake Erie, was one of the region's first commercial fishermen. He made his living selling fish door to door for a nickel and kept his ear to the ground when fugitives were in town.
The lake shore between Buffalo and Erie, Pennsylvania was just a quagmire of swamps and bogs. And of course, the easiest way to move along the lake shore was by bateau, the huge canoes or rowing boats, because the terrain was generally impassable.
Thousands crossed at Detroit and Buffalo, but you were much more likely to avoid detection if you first embarked from small port cities like Ashtabula, Erie, Westfield, Fredonia, and Dunkirk.
November 1st, 1841. The week has been cold. Some hard freezing and snow, now warm. Assisted 6 fugitives from oppression from this land of equal rights to the despotic government of Great Britain, where they can enjoy their liberty. Last night put them on board a steamboat and paid their passage to Buffalo. William Imrod.
Oh, the drinking Lord. Oh, the drinking Lord. For that old man is awakened for to carry you to freedom if you follow the drinking Lord.
The women of Sugar Grove filed one by one into the Miller Mansion on Big Tree Road. The Female Assisting Society had plenty of work to do now that more fugitives were heading their way. She was a strong and defiant woman, Cynthia Kathleen Miller. Like the row of rare hardwoods that bordered her land, she stood her ground, unwavering in her fight against slavery. Founder of the Female Assisting Society and the Ladies' Fugitive Aid Society, she organized sewing circles to make clothes for escaping slaves. Cynthia's nephew, Dr. James Catlin, was a leader in the Underground Railroad, having begun his career at an early age.
While a student at Allegheny College in Meadville, he secreted a fugitive slave for several days at great personal peril and finally spirited him away towards Canada. Cynthia Catlin Miller.
James became a successful physician and used his earnings to finance the True American, an abolitionist newspaper run by his brother Henry in Erie. Fugitives were concealed in paper bins until it was safe to sail away to Canada.
A fugitive from Southern society called at the door this morning. He was a fine-looking fellow of 30 years or so, and is making his 4th attempt at visiting Canada. He had camped out 31 of the last 36 nights, had frozen his feet at one point, and burned himself while asleep by his fire. Franklin Miller.
Had a call this morning from a couple of colored boys on their way to Canada and freedom. Curious that men are compelled to leave our so-styled free country to gain their liberty. But so it is, I helped them what I could, and with a Godspeed for the fugitive from American slavery, sent them on their way. Mortimer Payne.
It's not because the people coming are your friends. It's not because you can look at their lives and see similarities between your own and theirs. It's because you believe, because you're truly convicted that God is instructing you to do this. In Sugar Grove, religion is the driving force.
You see an increased participation by women in the life of the church, and you see an increase in anti-slavery activity based on religious commitment. People with a renewed conviction that slavery is sin. It's not just a political wrong. It's not just an economic wrong. It's sin.
The Miller family had this passage marked in their Bible. It's from Deuteronomy 23, verses 15 and 16. Slaves who have escaped to you from their owners shall not be given back to them. They shall dwell among you, in your midst, in any place they choose, in any one of your towns, wherever they please. You shall not oppress them. That's why you see in Sugar Grove, fugitives are not hiding in secret places. They shall dwell among you. That's the point. You're not going to treat them any differently than anyone else who comes and stays with you.
Many of the African Americans who arrived in Sugar Grove found employment as farmhands, laborers, and lumbermen. Some lived in a wooded area called Africa Hill, a free black community near the Horn and Andrews sawmill. Others stayed on farms, earning money for the next leg of their journey across Lake Erie to Canada. William Storm was in the perfect position to help. He owned a large farm just over the Pennsylvania line in Bust-Eye, New York. A man of color, he was well connected with the nation's leading abolitionists, especially now that his daughter Caroline had married the Reverend Jermaine Logan, an escaped slave from Tennessee, who was an outspoken advocate of the Liberty Party and a friend of white reformer Gerrit Smith. A granddaughter would later marry the son of fellow abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Even after the fugitive slave law went into effect, runaways felt safe on the store and farm. Safe, that is, until the morning of September 30th, 1851. Harrison Williams, one of 7 fugitives who had arrived in February, had just finished milking cows in the barnyard. The others had gone to see the Dandelight Circus in nearby Jamestown when a party of slave catchers ventured onto the property. Williams was stunned to see his Virginian master and the sheriff armed with an arrest warrant. His friends tried to ward off the attack, scrambling to get their guns, but they were too late. The posse handcuffed Williams and rushed off to Buffalo, seeking a speedy trial before the federal commissioner. News of the raid passed from house to house, and soon 30 armed neighbors were in pursuit. In a courtroom crowded with abolitionists, the judge ruled for the arrest.
The other slaves were concealed on Lanning Hill, then owned by Seth McDonald, for several days and fed by their friends. Those who saw them said they were well fortified on the haymow with clubs and stones and meant to fight to a finish. When they decided to make their way toward the North Star, Mrs. Pratt cooked them a midnight meal and sent them on their way rejoicing. They went to Beaver Dam in Erie County, were secreted by a wealthy farmer, William Gray, who delivered them on a boat at Erie, which landed them safely in Canada. Cynthia Catlin Miller.
The people of Sugar Grove were reviled by the Southern sympathizers from nearby Warren, but the people here had nothing to gain and everything to lose by being a part of the Underground Railroad. Being an abolitionist is one thing, but actually hiding a slave was another. You could be fined $1,000, which for a lot of people here was more than the value of everything you owned.
To be an abolitionist in the North was not an easy thing. It took a lot of courage. It took a lot of commitment. And in some ways, that's why the anti-slavery people in the North during this period were so impressive. Because these were terribly courageous and committed people. Black people and white people.
In the summer of 1854, more than 500 people attended an outdoor meeting in Sugar Grove where Reverend Jermaine Logan and Frederick Douglass called on their friends to take up the fight for equal rights.
Frederick Douglass and Dr. Thorne were here to tea. Douglass is stern and eloquent upon the stand, and gentle, sociable, and altogether agreeable at the fireside. It is but 16 years since he was a hunted fugitive from a southern plantation. Franklin Miller.
The personal stories of former slaves fueled the fire of the anti-slavery movement. But it was the publication of a single book that forever changed the course of public opinion. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, rocked the nation with its brutal revelations. Though a work of fiction, it was based on the lives of real people with whom the author was acquainted, including Lewis Clark, who lived in Sugar Grove. The book sold 300,000 copies within 1 year and was immediately translated into 19 languages. By 1860, there were more than 1 million copies circulating in the United States and more than 2 million abroad.
President Lincoln himself said that the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin did more to bring about the Civil War than any other single event. Stowe rightfully believed that it was only through the eyes of the fugitive slaves themselves that the nation could truly understand the horrors of slavery and what it meant to finally be free.
No one knows how long Joseph Tabor was in captivity before he escaped with his wife and child from Frederick County, Virginia in 1837. No one knows the anguish they suffered, leaving 3 of their children behind. What we do know is they pressed on for 2 years, finding strength and courage with each passing day. Even after reading